Welcome to the latest installment of First Miami's Archaeology Discipleship class. I am your host, Dr. Brian Janeway, and we are moving in to the New Testament today, which is kind of new territory and less familiar for me, actually. I have to state a couple things up front here that I'm not really trained and don't have all the classwork, coursework, and the rest in the New Testament. I had to choose one or the other when I first delved into these things, and I chose Old Testament because there was so much more to deal with archaeologically, historically, and a much larger time span. And you have so many more books, so much more history there to be able to work with. So, not that I preferred the Old Testament or the New. I mean, as a Christian, of course, I exalt and worship the new, but the old is very rich with archaeology and history, as you've seen over the past few talks. But now we move into the new, and I've never given a talk quite like this. In fact, I initially wanted to cover, and I'll have to tell you that I was a little too ambitious to go from the foundation or the founding of the church in the book of Acts all the way to the time of Constantine, when Christianity first became a legal religion in the Roman Empire in the Edict of Milan in AD 312. But as I began to read more and research, there was just way too much to do in 45 minutes. The first 3 centuries of the church are very eventful, and there's a lot of very important topics to talk about. So what I've done for today is to really just start from the beginning, the foundation, where the Holy Spirit comes in the Pentecost to found, where usually people date or with that event as the foundation of the church, and then deal with a lot with the book of Acts, because it has a lot of historical connections and contacts with other sources that we can look at, and we have archaeological things as well to talk about. And then a number of outside sources or extra biblical sources for the church and for Christ that are very early, mostly in the 1st century, but also the early 2nd century. So that's where we'll call a halt. And then I'll put the question to you as to what the next talk would be. Now, initially, I was going to do the New Testament and coins, which is kind of just a fun topic to deal with some of the coins that have actual names and rulers on them from the Bible. Or you might want to, if you want to delve more into this, the beginnings of the church, we could continue on after this initial one and then right on through to the time of Constantine and deal with the church councils, the early church controversies, which were very important to determine the nature of Christ and how the church was to understand all the things that were written, and then also the formation of the Bible itself and the canon. Which books were, how were they included? Which ones were not included? How did they arrive at this decision? And how do we get the Bibles that we have today? So I will pose that question to you now and later as to what your preference would be. So without further ado, we'll start with the presentation. So I think the key verse today, because we're talking about the beginnings of the church, are from Acts 2, chapter 1. And when the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And it goes on to say, let me move this out of. And suddenly there came from heaven a noise like a violent rushing wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. And there appeared to them tongues as of fire distributing themselves, and they rested on each one of them. Now, this is a rather bizarre sight, and someone tried to portray it here, where you have these tongues of fire resting on the individuals that were all gathered there. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit was giving them utterance. This is in Acts chapter 2. And evidently they were speaking in tongues that were understood. And that's a distinction that we make between babbling incomprehensibly, as some would say that when you're speaking in tongues you would do. But the example we have in the book of Acts is that they were speaking in intelligible tongues, in different languages that were understood at the time. So here we have the foundation of the church in the book of Acts. So we're, as I mentioned, we finished with the Old Testament, we're going to the New Testament, and this is the beginnings of the church. So think about, if you would like to, which of those topics you would like. As I mentioned before, here's a slide to give you something to think about over the course of this talk. And at the end, I'd like to get some input from you all as to what you'd like me to do. The Beginnings of the Church, Part 2, we could call that, or the New Testament in Coins. Okay, so Luke, we're dealing with the book of Acts, we're dealing with the author Luke, who also wrote the gospel. And most scholars would accept the fact that he wrote both of those as sort of like a two-part history, one being the gospel and the second being the foundation of the church. He begins in Luke chapter 1 with this statement, which gives sort of a mission statement, and it gives the indication he's serious about trying to tell a real history. He says, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were from the beginning, were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it all out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught. So let me go back to that. And then if I could just jump really quickly forward to the book of Acts, chapter 1, verse 1, he says, the first account I composed, Theophilus, about all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day when he was taken up, after he had by the Holy Spirit given orders to the apostles whom he had chosen. So the end of Luke ends with the ascension, and then we begin with the Acts of the Apostles here, where he's continuing his thread about writing to Theophilus about all the things that he investigated and found to be true. So I'm going to begin by something that happened before this, the Pentecost, in that it's just a remarkable artifact called the Pontius Pilate inscription. And we have a picture right here of Pontius Pilate as he appeared in Ben-Hur some 60 years ago on the left. And then here he is starting the famous chariot race near the end of the movie. Obviously, that's not him, but at least we have someone to look at and think about Pontius Pilate when we're talking about him. So this is the actual inscription that was found in the city of Caesarea, which was where the Romans governed. It was sort of like their local capital for Judea. And it's on the coast, and they found this stone in secondary usage back in the 1960s, I believe it was. And it was being used as a step in an amphitheater, which was also ancient, but from the Byzantine period. So they had reused the stone. It originally had been displayed in some public area, and then later it was taken down and reused as a step in a theater. And as you can see, it's partially effaced, but what we do have are a few important words, and it says, ... the Tiberium, which Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea, gave and dedicated. So it indicates that there's some sort of a temple or such that he is dedicating to Tiberius, who was the emperor at the time, here in Caesarea. This is what it might have looked like originally. And here's a nice close-up of it with the translation there. Very short, obviously, but it does give us the name of Pilate. It's now actually was the only thing we'd ever found with Pilate's name on it in the Holy Land or in Judea. Until recently, they found a ring which also has his name on it, which is thought by some to may have been one of his officials' rings, because it was made of, I think, copper or something. It's not a really well-made ring, but it does have his name on it. If he were the governor of Judea, he probably would have had a better ring. That's the thinking of this new discovery. But this one, of course, has his full name on it. And importantly, it has his title as prefect of Judea. Now, governors had one of two names, depending on whether they were governed by the emperor or overseen, or the Senate in Rome. So so he was initially, if it was a newly conquered territory, it would be the title would be procurator, and it would be under the auspices of the emperor. But then later on, when it became a settled part of the empire, it would go to the Senate, and he would be known as a prefect. So we know that this is an accurate title for Pontius Pilate at the time, as the prefect of Judea. Pretty remarkable find. So speaking in general of the book of Acts, J.B. Lightfoot, who was a scholar of well over a century ago, but I love this quote. He says about the book of Acts, no ancient work affords so many tests of veracity, for no other has such numerous points of contact in all directions with contemporary history, politics, and topography, whether Jewish, Greek, or Roman. Now you think about how the New Testament books are arranged. We have the four Gospels, so we have the life and times of Jesus, and then we go to the book of Acts, which is kind of a connective book that connects the events of the gospel itself in more or less a 3-year period during the ministry of Christ, and then gives the foundation and the founding of the church for a number of years afterwards. And then you have Romans and most of the Pauline epistles and the other ones that follow, and then finishing with the book of Revelation. So in a sense, you have the acts and sayings of Jesus, an early history, and then the interpretation of all those things by Paul and other of the authors of the New Testament. And then the final revelation at the end, where it's sort of consummated in a future times as yet to come. So when we look at the book of Acts, there are a number of interesting features. As Lightfoot said, there are many points of contact with history and with archaeological things. One of the features of Acts are the many speeches that are given by numerous authors in the book. And this was a very important part of ancient history telling in the Greek tradition and in the Roman period that followed. Acts contains 24 speeches. There are 8 by Peter, there are 9 by Paul, then there's 1 each by Stephen and James, and then there are 5 other ones by non-Christians, Gamaliel, who was a priest, a Jewish priest, Demetrius, a town clerk in the town of the city of Ephesus, Tertullus, and Festus. Now, altogether, these speeches comprise over 300 of the approximately 1,000 verses in the book of Acts, or as it's known, strictly speaking, as the Acts of the Apostles. So the question that scholars have been asking of these speeches for a number of years, well over a century now, in debating the historicity of the book overall, is, were they accurate records of speeches, or were they just literary constructs or creations by an author, whether he was Luke or someone else? Now, Thucydides was considered one of the first of the great historians in the Greek tradition. He says, as to the speeches, now he's talking about what his period was writing about, the history of the Peloponnesian War in the 5th century BC. And he wrote, as to the speeches which were made either before or during the war, it was hard for me and for others who reported them to me to recollect the exact words. I have therefore put into the mouth of each speaker the sentiments proper to the occasion, expressed as I thought he would be likely to express them, while at the same time I endeavored, as nearly as I could, to give the general purport of what was actually said. So it was impossible for him to record it all verbatim. He may not have even been there for the speech itself. He may have heard it secondhand, but then he recorded what he thought was appropriate for the occasion and the speaker himself. We have another example in Lucian, who, and this is a much later engraving, but I just wanted to have something up there for you to see. He was called Lucian of Samosata, and he's from the early 2nd century AD. And he talks about history writing in general and says, the one aim and goal of history is to be useful, and this can result only from truth. The one task of the historian is to describe things exactly as they happened. This is the one essential thing in history, to sacrifice to truth alone. So we asked the question then of his speeches. Some have said over the years that all the speeches are kind of the same. They have the same elements. There's like an introduction, and there's a recollecting of Old Testament passages, relate them to new passages, some of the things that Jesus said or did, but they're not actually all the same. And they all contain different elements and different aspects of the speeches that are quite different between Peter and Paul and the others. So that would be one perhaps argument to make, that they were actually recollections of actually different speeches that were actually given by the different speakers. As well, many scholars point to the accuracy of Luke in the gospel accounts, and the various things that you can compare in the various gospel accounts, and that Luke recorded them faithfully, as we know of from the gospel, and that we should assume that he's being accurate and faithful in his portrayal of the speeches when we move to the book of Acts. A second aspect of the book of Acts are the so-called we passages. So there are a number of these, 4 of them in particular. Acts chapter 16, where they're journeying from Troas to Philippi. So in these passages, he's speaking as if he is with Paul when he's making these journeys. In Acts chapter 20, they journey from Philippi to Miletus. In Acts chapter 21, they go from Miletus to Jerusalem. And finally, in Acts 27, they journey from Caesarea to Rome, where, of course, Paul is going for trial after he was arrested in Jerusalem. So the we passages, and here's a nice map to show all the various journeys. And I guess it might be a good time to sort of generalize in what is happening with these various journeys. So as you recall, the early missionary sort of center for Christian activity was the city of Antioch, which is today in the country of Turkey. And so the white line here gives the first journey of Paul's missionary activity, which he undertook with Barnabas. So they first go to Cyprus, which you'll see here, and then he goes up to what is today Turkey, and it goes to a number of cities up here in this area, including another Antioch, actually Antioch of Pisidia. And we'll talk a little about one of the things that he found, a couple of things that apply to this particular journey. His second journey, he goes overland over what is today Turkey. Then he crosses the Aegean up here and goes into ancient Greece and visits a whole number of cities, makes his way down to Athens, to Corinth. And that's a very important stop there, Corinth, because he comes back again to Corinth. And then he jumps across back to Turkey, to Miletus. This is one of those we passages. And then all the way back to Jerusalem in his second missionary journey. His third journey in blue, again, he goes over land across Turkey, he goes up the coast, and he jumps across, and again, revisits a lot of the same cities that he visited in his second journey. And here, he comes back, jumps across to by sea here to the southern coast of Turkey, and then back to Jerusalem. And then finally, his journey to Rome. Some people call this the fourth missionary journey, and it was actually in effect for him because he was always an evangelist, even when he was under arrest. But this was actually after he was arrested and he was demanding to be put on trial and given a hearing before Caesar as a Roman citizen. So this, it's called the shipwreck journey. He takes off by boat on a Roman boat, and he heads off north around Cyprus, makes landfall in port here again in Turkey. This is, of course, way before it was Turkey. And then he comes around the south of Crete. He shipwrecks here in the island of Malta, and then he makes his way eventually to Rome. So that's a little general summary of his travels and his missionary journeys. So Paul's shipwreck voyage, this is 2 chapters worth of material. There was an ancient author, which some of the modern scholars, they still refer to because he made a remarkable observation. He was an amateur yachtsman of many, many years who traveled throughout the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. Now, this is in the 1840s he wrote this. His quote, with having all this experience in the area with his yacht, said of the account of the shipwreck voyage, his style, though accurate, is unprofessional. No sailor would have written in a style so little like that of a sailor. No man, not a sailor, could have written a narrative of a sea voyage so consistent in all of its parts, unless from actual observation. This peculiarity of style is to me in itself a demonstration that the narrative of the voyage is an account of real events written by an eyewitness. The geographical details must have been taken from actual observation, for the geographical knowledge of the age was not such as to enable a writer to be so minutely accurate in any other way. So this was his observation of the shipwreck voyage of Paul in Acts chapter 27 and 28. And he goes into many more details about that in his work. And I kind of summarized some of those. And by the way, this was the first article I actually published in a journal, was the historicity, that is the book of Acts historically credible? And I can send that to you all if you want. And I go into much more detail about this particular shipwreck voyage, and all the details that James Smith observed were accurate, as if you would have to have been an eyewitness to write them. Now we move to some of the principal figures in the book of Acts, who we call pillars of the early church. Now they're referred to as pillars by Paul in Galatians chapter 2. He says, "And recognizing the grace that had been given to me, James and Cephas, or Peter, and John, who were reputed to be pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, so that we might go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised." So Paul was saying that these pillars, these 3 pillars, gave me the right hand of fellowship to go and preach to the Gentiles. They were going to go to the circumcised. So it was a way of kind of divvying up their labors and actually evangelizing different groups of people. So here we have evidence now of James, one of those early pillars. Now, he would have been the half brother of Jesus, so born after Jesus by Mary. Now, Catholics would not believe this is true because they believe that Mary was a virgin for her entire life. And so the brothers and sisters referred to in a couple of passages were not actual biological brothers and sisters of Jesus, but they were spiritual brothers or sisters. But I think if a clear reading of some of these passages indicate that they were actual biological younger brothers and sisters. So we have here the book of James, who was authored by the brother of Jesus, or the half brother of Jesus. Now he's mentioned by Josephus, who was a late first century Jewish author who had been a general in the war of rebellion against the Romans between 66 and 70 AD. And then later on, he wrote histories of the Jews as being patroned by one of the Roman officials. So he wrote these histories after he had been defeated and lost, but he was a writer, a historian, and he wanted to write about the Jewish people and sort of present the history of his people to the Romans, to the much larger Roman world. Now, Josephus says that the high priest Ananus had James stoned to death in AD 62. And another author named Hegesippus in the 2nd century reports something slightly different. He says that James was thrown from the pinnacle of the temple, and then he was stoned and clubbed to death, where he was buried on the spot. So we're not quite sure what the end of James was. Probably Josephus might be more accurate here, and being closer to the events and being contemporary to the events of the time. This is a much later rendering of James here in a 13th century portrait. Now, just a few years ago, this hit the news. The box or the ossuary of James was discovered. It was in the possession of a collector who claims that he bought it from someone else. But this was an illicit purchase of antiquities. So this was illegally dug up somewhere. No one knows where, probably in the area of Jerusalem, and it made its way to a collector. This happens, unfortunately, a lot in the antiquities market. So here we have several reports of this new bone box that had been found. This is only about now less than 20 years ago. Here's a picture of it, and you see it's rather rough, but it has enough space in these ossuaries to contain all the bones of the human body. They would be gathered up after about a year of decomposition and put into these bone boxes, and then put into a family tomb and pushed back into various niches that were cut around a central chamber, which would have had a bed or a bench upon which the body would be laid when it was first put to rest, and then dressed with aloes and myrrh, we presume, as was the tradition of the Jews, like they did to Jesus after he was crucified. So here we have an inscription which makes this particular bone box extremely important and significant. It is in Aramaic. It reads from right to left, and it says Yaakov bar Yosef Ahui Yeshua, which means James or Jacob, and James is the Greek version of Jacob, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. And two words here indicate that it is Aramaic and not Hebrew. That would be bar, son of, and Ahui, brother of, which indicate the slight variation and differences between Aramaic, which we know was the language spoken of by first century Jews, and Hebrew, classical Hebrew. So we have the bone box of James. Now, this has been clouded with a little bit of controversy because, again, it was found not in a real excavation under controlled circumstances, but by a collector and then sold. But testing that they did on this indicates that there's a certain microorganisms that accumulate on cut stone after it's freshly cut. And over centuries of time, it accumulates and can be kind of examined with a microscope. And specialists can look at these, what are called patinas, and determine their rough age, depending on the accumulation of the patina on the surface of the stone. And what they found was the surface of the bone box was the same as when they examined in the incision or the cut marks of the inscription itself. There was the same level of accumulation of patina. So that was a really strong argument. There are many other aspects of this that we could talk about, but I'll go move on from that and say that I believe that it's authentic. Many people do believe that this is an authentic bone box of the brother of Jesus, James, one of the pillars of the early church. And by the way, he was the leader of the church in Jerusalem in the first generation or so of the church there. Now we move to the first missionary journey of Paul when he first goes over to Cyprus, and he meets a ruler by the name of Sergius Paulus. Now, this inscription is actually from Antioch of Pisidia, which is where he went after he left Cyprus. So the thinking is here that if this is the same Sergius Paulus, that he may have this may be his ancestral home in Antioch of Pisidia, and he had family there. So after he apparently became a believer due to Paul's preaching, he sent Paul to his family in Antioch of Pisidia to talk and preach to them. So this inscription was found in 1912. So just to recount here, we're looking at the white line. He met Sergius Paulus here in Paphos, and then he went by sea to, he landed here at Attalia and then went upland inland to Antioch of Pisidia here, where he may have met family of Sergius Paulus. We know some other things about Sergius Paulus from other inscriptions. One that was found near Paphos, it mentions a proconsul Paulus, who may have been the proconsul Sergius Paulus of Cyprus at the time. And this was during the reign of Claudius. This is a monumental dedication. There's also a boundary stone in Rome, erected by the Emperor Claudius, which also mentions a list of curators of the Tiber River and its banks, which includes one L. Sergius Paulus. And then finally, Pliny the Elder describes Cyprus as being, this is very interesting because it ties into some of the things that Paul encountered there. He cites Sergius Paulus as a source. In his book, Natural History, he describes Cyprus as being overrun with sorcery. And in the book of Acts, it actually says there existed different groups of magicians from the time of Moses, of whom the Jews had spoken of. Elymas, the magician, attempted to deceive Paulus. So this was in the book of Acts. So that sort of ties right into what we know from the inscriptions of Cyprus. Now, the next one we're looking at is the balustrade inscription. They've actually found two examples of this. It's a little bit fragmentary, but there's enough here to know exactly what it was. It said, "No foreigner may enter in within the railing and enclosure that surround the temple." So this was a warning sign that was put around a fence that surrounded the temple of Herod at the time of Jesus. It goes on to say, "Anyone apprehended shall have himself to blame for his consequent death." So this was a death sentence that was as a warning to anyone who came in, any foreigner or Gentile who came into the court of the temple beyond where this sign was mounted. And this incident in the book of Acts, chapter 21, is called the Trophimus incident because Paul was falsely accused of taking an individual, a Gentile by the name of Trophimus, into the temple precinct. And then he was falsely accused by the Jews and then arrested and taken into sort of house arrest by the Romans and taken up to Caesarea. So here is a mock-up of the Herodian temple, and around the red circle here you see what is a low fence that surrounded the actual temple itself, and around these entrances, as you can see spaced around, we presume that that's where these warning signs would have been located. So they were serious about keeping purity in the temple, and Gentiles were simply not allowed to go past those points. Now we move to another famous inscription known as the Gallio inscription, found in the Greek city of Delphi at a temple site in that city. And this is important because when Paul spent time in Corinth, and he made 2 visits there and spent quite a bit of time, he encountered a proconsul there of Achaia by the name of Gallio. So in Acts chapter 18, I'll quote here and say that but while Gallio was proconsul in Achaia, the Jews rose up together against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat, saying, "This man is inciting the people to worship God contrary to the law." But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of some crime or vicious, unscrupulous act, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you." He goes on to say, "But if there are questions about teaching and persons and your own law, see to it yourselves. I am unwilling to be a judge of these matters." And he drove them away from the judgment seat. But they all took hold of Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and began beating him in front of the judgment seat. And yet Gallio was not concerned about any of these things. This is actually a theme that seems to recur, and some scholars believe that this is a way that the early Christian authors were apologists for their faith to make to the Roman world, and making it seem as if they didn't have to be anything concerned with the new Christian faith as being a threat their rule or to their power. So we have several instances, for example, when Pontius Pilate, Christ is brought before Pilate, and the Jews, make accusations against him and say that he needs to do something about this, and they put him to death and all. And Pilate initially says, "I don't even want to get involved in all your theological disputes. I'm just going to, forget about this. He hasn't done anything wrong that you've told me, so forget about it." But then they come back and they persist. And then remember, he famously washes his hands of the affair. He says, "Okay, I'm going to do your bidding." Well, he doesn't actually say that, but he says, "Okay, we'll put him to death. I'm going to wash my hands of this, and then we'll be done with it." So it seems like this is another case where the author is saying that this should be considered like not a threat to the Romans. And then the Romans' attitude was, "I don't want to get involved in your disputes unless you actually commit a real crime. Then you settle it yourselves." But this Gallio inscription is important because it can be dated very accurately within the 2 years of his reign, or actually the inscription 50 to 51 AD. And now we know, of course, that Paul was there during that very year or two, plus or minus, in the city of Corinth. This is the temple in Delphi where it was found, the inscription. The inscription itself is a letter from the Emperor Claudius, who ruled between 41 and 54. And he says, "To Lucius Junius Gallio, my friend and the proconsul of Achaia." So here again, we have an accurate use of titles used by Luke to apply to Gallio, proconsul of Achaia. It's dated AD 52, 1 year after Paul's appearance there in Acts chapter 18. Now we move to Ephesus. We keep jumping around here. I apologize for that, but there's a lot of different geographical things going on with all these journeys. So we're looking here at the Great Theater in Ephesus, which is in modern day Turkey. It could seat in its heyday 25,000 people. And it's obviously very well preserved. If you ever get to Turkey, you've got to go to Ephesus and see this place. It's fabulous. So we had a lot of events happening here in Ephesus. And the one I want to refer to here is when Paul was preaching there in Ephesus, he was starting to have an impact on the local population who were worshiping the goddess Artemis or Diana, depending on the Greek or the Roman representation of this deity. And they had one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world in Ephesus, which was the Temple of Diana or Artemis. So as he was preaching his gospel, people were not buying, according to the account in the book of Acts, representations or idols of the goddess. So there were silversmiths who made a business at selling silver statues of Artemis, and they started to become unhappy, and they started to rouse the population against Paul. So it says in Acts chapter 9, "But when they recognized he was a Jew, a single outcry arose from them all as they shouted for about 2 hours in the theater." This was taking place. "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." So they're proclaiming their goddess, their patron goddess. Now people would have come from far and wide, pilgrims, to come to Ephesus to worship the great Artemis at the great temple that was there for centuries. It goes on to say, "After quieting the crowd, the town clerk said, 'Men of Ephesus, what person is there after all who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is the guardian of all the temple of the great Artemis and of the image which fell down from the sky,'" which is what they believed the original image had done. Oops, I jumped ahead a couple, sorry about that. So here we have a reconstruction or recreation of what the ancient temple looked like. It was somewhat like the Parthenon, but it was actually much larger. This would have been an incredible structure to see. There's almost nothing of it left today to see except this, because even in ancient times, they robbed out the building stones and reused them in other buildings and temples and such. So this is what you see of the great temple of Artemis today in Ephesus. Now, it also turns out there's an inscription which kind of reflects the historicity, the accuracy of the titles being used in this passage in Ephesus. This is the Valerius Festus Monument. It's about 3.5 foot tall. It was found near the theater in Ephesus. It dates to a later time, the late 2nd century, early 3rd century. It was dedicated to an individual by the name of Valerius Festus by the Guild of Silversmiths. It refers to the town clerk. Actually, the book of Acts, the town clerk referred to there speaks of Ephesus as the temple keeper or the temple guardian of the goddess Artemis or Diana, using the Greek term neokoros, which is almost unique to Ephesus itself, that appears on the monument here and in other inscriptions found in Ephesus. So that would seem to indicate some eyewitness knowledge and contemporary with the events. Other uses of titles, certain of the Asiarchs is mentioned in Acts chapter 9, uses the title Asiarchoi, which is found nowhere else in the New Testament, but it's common again to inscriptions found in Ephesus. These were like local rulers. One of the Asiarchs appearing in the inscriptions there is also called secretary or grammateus, the same term used by Luke as translated as town clerk. So we have a very accurate recollection recording of titles of officials, of various officials throughout the book of Acts. I could go into many more, but we don't have time for them. And I just want to show you a couple of representations of the the deity or the goddess Artemis. She's depicted as a hunter in some of these ancient sculptures, also as a fertility goddess. And these has been various interpreted as a fruit and other things that are adorning the body of the goddess. Now, we also have a narrative in the book of Acts, chapter 23 and 25, and forgive me as I read again. I don't like to read too many things, but there's so many inscriptions here and they're important and accounts that I want you to get exactly what they say. So Acts chapter 23 to 25 in the book of Acts names several rulers with their wives before whom Paul was tried. So remember, he was arrested at the temple. The Romans took him into house arrest. They brought him up to Caesarea, where he spent some time thinking about what he had done wrong. And he had a chance to speak to the rulers over his time there. Now, one scholar notes that there's a very remarkable piece of synchronization on the part of the author taking place here. So as I write in my article, Paul encountered the high priest Ananias prior to appearing before the procurator Felix. Felix was married to Drusilla. After some interval of time, Festus succeeded him as the procurator of Judea. Now, this is, of course, after the time of Pontius Pilate. These are successors to him. So Felix is succeeded by Festus shortly after arriving in Palestine. So Festus comes along. He speaks to Festus as well. Festus gave a hearing to Paul before Agrippa II, whose sister Bernice was living with him at the time. Given such a quilt work of persons and events, it would have taken a considerable amount of research for a later historian to piece all of this together. And all of these titles and names are accurate in Acts chapter 23 through 25. Now, as we look, get the big picture here of Paul's letters and his missionary journeys, we have a whole chronology that we can build based upon known synchronisms, and in particular, that Gallio inscription right here during his second missionary journey. So it's almost like you can pin the synchronism right in the middle of this, all the events before and after that we know about his life. And then based upon the book of Acts, we can march them back and forward and develop a whole chronology. And here this chart shows where the books that he wrote appear in the chronology, his various missionary journeys and how long he spent there in all these different places. Of course, this all ends in around AD 62 or so, where he's in Rome under house arrest, and that's where the book of Acts ends, kind of leaves you hanging. He spent several years there. And of course, when he was under house arrest, people were coming to him, local Jews and local Gentiles, and he was talking to them, conferring with them, preaching to them. So his ministry continued right to the end. Okay, oops, I jumped ahead again too much. So to summarize this last journey in red, he ends up in Rome. Some people refer to a verse which suggests that he was going to go to Spain to also evangelize, but most people believe that that didn't occur. It was an aspirational statement rather than an accurate one, because it also makes difficult the chronology that we know of that we can establish as being more certain. Now, we have a number of other sources outside of the book of Acts. So we've basically covered the book of Acts, which begins after the ascension of Christ, and we have the Pentecost. And actually, it says the Acts of the Apostles, but it's mostly about Peter and even more about Paul. There are a couple of others. They're all mentioned there. But when you talk about the Acts of the Apostles, it's really mostly Paul with a little bit of Peter in the beginning. Now we move to a number of sources that relate to the early church outside of the Bible. Probably the most famous or important of these is the historian Tacitus, who lived between 56 and 120. He was a senator and an historian of the Roman Empire. He wrote something called the Annals in about 115 AD. Now we're coming up on 1 o'clock, and I'm going to ask for your indulgence once again. If we can go maybe about 10 more minutes, I think we can finish up, and then we'll have some Q&A, and you can tell me where we go from here. So Tacitus goes on to say here, probably the most important source outside of the New Testament for the early church. He references the fire of Rome, which took place in AD 64, in which Nero, the Emperor Nero, scapegoated the Christians because he was getting the blame for it. And the account by Tacitus says that in order to avoid being blamed for it, he blamed the Christians, and then he underwent a persecution of the Christians in Rome. He wrote, quote, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So we have a nice correspondence and confirmation of what we read of in the New Testament there about his being executed by Pontius Pilate. He goes on to say, now he was a proud Roman. He worshiped the emperor and the other Roman gods and goddesses. So he looked down and condescended to these new religious apostates called Christians. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil. Now we have a source for Christianity coming out of Judea, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, but as of hatred against mankind. So he's as much as admitting that they were falsely arrested and accused, but they kind of deserved it anyway, because they were these lowly Christians, these wild, superstitious people, and they had to be dealt with. So this hatred of humanity and mankind was a charge that was brought against early Christians oftentimes because they didn't engage in the same worship of the emperor and other gods and goddesses. So they withdrew to themselves in their own forms of worship, which were just emerging at the time. So they were often accused of hating their fellow man. Another reference from Josephus again, who again was that Roman general. He was a Pharisee, he was a general, and he was employed essentially to write histories by the Emperor Vespasian. He mentions John the Baptist, and he says, reporting that some thought the defeat of Herod's army, this is back to the time of John the Baptist, was just a penalty for killing John, though he was a good man, quote, who bade the Jews practice virtue, be just to one another, pious toward God, and come together in baptism. So we have a nice summary of actually what John was preaching from Josephus' perspective. This is from History of the Jewish War Against the Romans, written in AD 77. Another passage, he mentions James. On James, brother of Jesus, the high priest Ananus took advantage after the death of the procurator Festus to assemble a council of judges and bring before it the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ, and having accused them as lawbreakers, delivered him over to be stoned. As I mentioned before, Josephus says that James was stoned to death. That's from the Antiquities of the Jews, written in AD 93. And this is a very famous passage known as the Testonium Flavianum, written by Josephus, again, about AD 93. Now, this seems almost too good to be true. So it probably is. It's thought by most scholars that a later interpreter of the original passage added to this to make it seem as if he was a believer in Christ himself. So what I have done here is highlighted the parts that are considered to be added later, which are probably not authentic to the original passage. He says, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. Quote, I mean, almost in parentheses, he was the Christ. Probably not written by Josephus. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing amongst us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him and did not give up their affection for him. On the third day, he appeared to them restored to life, for the prophets of God had prophesied these and countless other marvelous things about him. It almost sounds like the Nicene Creed or something, a formulation of the early church. And then finishes by saying, and the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. And this is AD 93. Suetonius, another historian, writer, and secretary to the Emperor Hadrian, wrote the lives of the 12 Caesars. So it's sort of biographies of 12 different emperors. He mentions during the time of life of Nero, punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men addicted to a novel and mischievous superstition. So we go back to Nero and the fire of Rome and his false accusation against the Christians, and they're rounding them up and torturing them. Also, he mentions in the life of Claudius, as the Jews were making constant disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome. So some kind of a dispute between the Jews and the Christians, or maybe he thought it was the Christians. Again, the Roman emperors usually didn't pay a whole lot of attention to making distinctions. They were all Jews to them, and they were always making trouble. So Claudius at this point actually makes a point of expelling them from Rome. And this expulsion is actually mentioned, and we know the date of it, AD 49, in the book of Acts. And at the bottom, you'll see the passage in Acts chapter 18, where it says Paul, when he was in Corinth in AD 50 to 52, Luke writes that Paul found Aquila and Priscilla in the city of Corinth, a Jewish couple who had recently been expelled from Rome by Claudius' edict. So you can see only 2 years, 1 or 2 years before, the chronology matches up incredibly closely between the book of Acts and these extra biblical sources. Pliny the Younger, who lived in the latter part of the first century, first part of the second century. He was a nephew of the elder and a governor of Bithynia in Asia Minor during the reign of Trajan, from whom he received the following advice. Now, Bithynia in Asia was in northwest Turkey today. So he said, now this is, of course, Trajan writing to Pliny, giving me advice as to how he handles Christians. He says, for the moment, this is the line I've taken with all persons brought before me on the charge of being Christians. Now remember, this is long before Christianity was legal, so it was an illegal religion. He says, I have asked them in person if they are Christians. If they admit it, I repeat the question a second time and a third time with a warning of the punishment awaiting them. If they persist, I order them to be led away for punishment. For whatever the nature of their admission, I am convinced that their stubbornness and unshakable obstinacy ought to be punished. So again, they don't have to be accused of anything in particular, in this case, to be found guilty. For him, it was enough that they were Christians, and if they really believed it, he asked them 3 times. If they persisted, well, then they were deserving of punishment, even unto death. Now, the Babylonian Talmud is another Jewish source that we find. It was written over a number of years, over a century of time, between 70 and 200. And we find several mentions of Jesus and the early church. And this is a summary of what it says, that Jesus was born out of wedlock and was a transgressor in Israel. That kind of matches what we know. Born of a virgin, if they out of wedlock. He was a transgressor because he was preaching against the ruling elite, the Pharisees and the Sadducees at the time. He practiced sorcery, which he learned in Egypt, and performed many marvelous works in order to deceive the people. He called himself God. He was found guilty by the Sanhedrin of apostasy and teaching heresy, exactly what we find in the gospel accounts. And on Passover Eve, he was executed by hanging on a tree. He was crucified. All of that matches pretty much what we know of from the New Testament sources. So we have a summary of the sources, extra biblical sources about the church here. Jesus lived during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. We can confirm that. He lived a virtuous life and worked miracles. He claimed to be the Messiah. He had a brother named James. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate on the eve of Passover. Darkness and an earthquake occurred when he died. His disciples believed he rose from the dead and were willing to die for their belief. They refused the worship of the Roman gods and worshiped Jesus as God. And Christianity spread far and wide, even to Rome. So when we look at the spread of the church, this is a nice map which shows the time. The purple areas up to the time of Irenaeus in the late 2nd century, about 188 AD. So you see the purple areas. What's striking is how much of Turkey, actually that's about half of modern day Turkey right there, was Christianized very early on. And we could probably credit Paul and his missionary journeys all throughout this area as being partially responsible for that. Right down through Judea, we have Egypt, parts of North Africa, over here to what is Carthage, ancient Carthage, and then Greece, parts of Greece here where Paul again visited, and then right to Italy itself, and then expanding during by the time of Constantine around 325, all the green areas. Now we're spreading into Western Europe, France, Spain, and even up into Britain. We'll get to that next time if that's what you'd like to do. We'll continue the history of the early church, but we'll move here to a conclusion and invite you attend the next talk, which will be November 14th, the next First Miami Archaeology Discipleship Group, excuse me, where we'll talk about either the beginnings of the church, part 2, or the New Testament in coins. You can find more information at firstmiami.org/groups to learn more about our group. And so I would summarize by saying what we know about the early church through the book of Acts. Now, I didn't talk a whole lot about the author, whether it was Luke or not. There are many scholars today that think that Luke wasn't the author, that the book of Acts was written much later, say in the 2nd century. But I think by the things I've shown you today, and I can show you many other things that accord so closely with the names and the dates and the events of the 1st century, in the middle of the 1st century, we're talking about roughly about AD 33 or so till about 62 or 3, when it's believed that during Nero's reign, when he persecuted the Christians, that both Paul was beheaded, executed, and Peter was also killed at that time during that persecution. So you have about a 30-year period in the book of Acts. And as I've recounted here, many correspondences to historical events and peoples and dates, which I think makes the case for authenticity or for contemporary authorship and eyewitness very strong. The we passages, all those things we talked about. So we also talked about the extra biblical sources, which accord very much with what we know from the Bible and from the book of Acts as well. So all these things come together to paint a picture of the early church, which was under persecution, sometimes by the Jews, sometimes by the Romans. Now that changes over time, and we may have a chance to talk about that at our next talk, which things start to change after the destruction of the temple, when the Jewish faith undergoes a real crisis and no longer is in a position to persecute the young and incipient church in the 1st century. But we'll talk about those things some other time, maybe the next talk, and I'll conclude there. It is 11 minutes after 1. Thanks for your patience. And if any of you want to have any questions or comments, you can open up your audio and also weigh in on what you'd rather have us talk about next time, more of the early church history or talk about coins. Thank you very much for your patience.